I just don't get you. You're always railing against hierarchy. What's so bad about having some structure in society? Hierarchy is natural, you know. Every stable society had leaders and followers. Even in nature there's a pecking order. Some birds lead the flock, some wolves lead the pack. It's just how order works.
I'm railing against unjust hierarchy because it's not as natural as you think. Sure, animals have pecking orders, but humans can make conscious choices. We've built societies around principles before. We're not wolves. And even if hierarchy has been common, that doesn't make it good or necessary. A lot of natural things like disease aren't things we want to keep around. Maybe people accepted kings and lords for centuries, but that was often because dissent got you thrown in a dungeon. Just because something was, doesn't mean it must be.
So you think egalitarianism is the cure-all, that everyone can be perfectly equal in status and power? Sounds utopian. In the real world people have different abilities, ambitions, and yes, power. There will always be some form of hierarchy. Even your anarchist communes end up with informal leaders or influencers. You can't avoid it. And frankly, a bit of hierarchy provides direction. If everyone tries to have equal say on everything, you get chaos or paralysis. Someone's got to steer the ship.
Of course people have different talents, I'm not denying that. Egalitarianism doesn't mean everyone is identical or makes the same decision simultaneously. It means no one inherently deserves more rights or power than anyone else. Any leadership should be by merit, temporary and accountable, not some fixed pyramid of power. You mention anarchist communes having informal leaders. Yeah, difference is, those leaders don't get a crown and a castle for life. They can be questioned or replaced if they stop serving the group's needs. That's the key: hierarchy without rigid authority. We can have organization and coordination without turning it into some people permanently on top and others permanently at the bottom.
I'm hearing a lot of idealism. Let's move to something concrete: governance. You basically want to abolish the state entirely, right? No government, no formal law enforcement, nothing. How is that not a recipe for disorder? I trust a stable government more than some nebulous community consensus. Governments create laws, enforce them, and keep society from descending into a free-for-all. You really expect everyone to magically cooperate just because the state is gone? Power abhors a vacuum. Without a state, warlords or mobs would take over before you finish singing the first verse of the Internationale.
Nice touch with the song reference. But seriously, I don't believe in no structure or chaos. I believe in self-governance. There's a difference. We want to replace the top-down state with grassroots decision-making. Councils, assemblies, whatever form it takes, people organize themselves. It's not everyone does whatever they want all the time. It's communities agreeing on rules and norms that serve them, rather than rules imposed by a distant government that mainly serves the rich or some elite. And as for warlords thrive when there's a power vacuum and an unarmed, passive population. In anarchism, the idea is people are empowered to defend their communities. No standing army or centralized police force telling you what to do. But if someone tries to impose themselves violently, the community stands up to them together. Kind of hard to be a warlord when the people refuse to be governed, don't you think?
That sounds optimistic. In theory, maybe communities handle everything. In practice, people are selfish and will shirk responsibilities. I can't see everyone attending community meetings or doing guard duty or whatever. Many would freeload off the responsible folks. At least a government provides structure and professional administration, experts to handle complexities of running society, and law enforcement. How do you replace that? Do you really trust the community to fairly handle, say, a murder or theft? We have courts and cops for a reason, to ensure justice is served by rule of law, not by mob or personal bias.
It's not like I think crime evaporates in an anarchist society, if that's what you mean. But consider this. Our current system isn't exactly perfect justice either. Courts and cops often serve those in power. The wealthy get away with stuff that would land a poor person in jail. Marginalized communities often face brutality instead of protection. So rule of law is frequently rule of law for some and rule of force for others. In an anarcho-communist setup, justice would be more community-driven, restorative justice, for example. The emphasis would be on making things right, rather than locking people in cages by default. And prevention, a more equal society would address a lot of causes of crime, like poverty and alienation. Sure, it won't be paradise, humans are messy, but I trust a community that has a stake in each member's well-being to handle these issues more humanely than an impersonal state that often just protects property and privilege.
Property and privilege, here we go on property. Let's talk about that. I can already guess you think property is theft, right? Roll's eyes look. Private property, owning your home, your stuff, maybe a business, that's a fundamental right. If I work for something, put my effort and creativity into it, why should someone else get to claim a share just because we're in the same community? Property rights motivate people. You aren't going to put in hard work if you don't get to enjoy the fruits of your labor. Property is what gives people a stake in society. Take that away, and you kill initiative. No one washes a rental car, as they say.
I had a feeling you'd bring up the classic fruits of my labor argument, but ask yourself, in our current society, do most people really enjoy the fruits of their labor? The average worker works for a company, which is someone else's property, and the fruits of their labor mostly go to the owner or shareholders. That's what I mean by property is theft, not your personal toothbrush or your clothes, but the private ownership of the means of production, factories, land, machines by a small group. Those owners appropriate the value everyone creates. In an anarcho-communist world, we distinguish personal possessions from productive property. You can have your house, your personal stuff. Nobody's interested in communal underwear, trust me. Grins, but things like large-scale land, factories, resources, those should be owned by the community that works them. That way, if you put in work, you truly share in the full fruit of that work instead of most of it going to some landlord or capitalist.
So basically nobody individually owns anything that matters. The community owns it. Sounds like a recipe for disaster to me. When everyone owns something, nobody really takes responsibility for it. It's the tragedy of the commons. People overuse or neglect what isn't personally theirs. If a factory or farm is just this communal thing, who's in charge of maintaining it or improving it? In the Soviet Union, which tried a variant of this, people would slack off because hey, the state owns it, not me. Productivity tanked. And don't tell me that wasn't real communism. When your system meets reality, human nature kicks in. Some folks work hard, some don't. But under communal ownership, they all expect an equal share. It's unfair to the industrious and a free ride for the lazy.
I had a feeling you'd mention the Soviet Union. I'm no fan of that bureaucratic state capitalism. They claim to be communist but had a huge authoritarian state. Basically the opposite of what I advocate. In a genuinely anarchist setup, communities would manage resources directly, without some distant bureaucracy. And about the tragedy of the commons, that's one of the most misused concepts. Historically, commons were managed by communities with rules to prevent overuse. It wasn't a free-for-all, people actually coordinated. Also, when people have a direct stake and voice in a communal resource, they often care more, not less. Think of a community garden. If everyone around enjoys it and tends to it, it can thrive. It's when an impersonal authority owns something that individuals feel disconnected and don't care. And sure, some people might slack, but social pressure in a small community is a powerful thing. If Tom isn't pulling his weight on the farm, you better believe his neighbors will call him out. I'm not saying it's perfect, but neither is a system where a few folks own everything and plenty of others bust their backs for crumbs.
We just have very different trust in people. You trust that communities will do the right thing collectively. I trust that strong institutions and maybe a bit of enlightened self-interest keep things running. Let's touch on law enforcement and order a bit more because it still bugs me. Say we have no police as we know them. A group of people in your community decide to break the agreed norms, maybe a gang forms, or someone starts harming others. In a state you call 911 and professionals handle it. In your scenario, what, you form a posse? Isn't that ripe for vigilantism or uneven justice? I can't shake the image of mob justice or just letting things slide because nobody wants to confront a neighbor.
It's a fair concern. Anarchists do talk about community defense or community accountability. It might look somewhat like a neighborhood watch, but with more collective oversight and trained volunteers rather than random vigilantes. Basically, people in the community would be tasked rotating, perhaps, with keeping an eye out and stepping in if someone's in danger. Conflict resolution would be a big part of it too, like mediation or assemblies to address grievances. Think of it this way, right now, if someone's causing trouble, often it's because something's wrong, maybe they need help, or had a dispute. Instead of immediately jumping to force, an anarchist community would try to solve the underlying problem. Of course, if someone's violent and won't stop, the community can physically intervene to stop harm. We're not just going to say please while getting robbed. Smirks, but the idea is to handle it without the institutional brutality we see in a lot of policing today. And importantly, those who do the protecting are part of the community, known to others and accountable to them. It's not like some separate warrior caste who can abuse power with impunity.
You make it sound almost nice in theory, I admit. However, I still think you underestimate how much we benefit from established order and tradition. Let's pivot to that, tradition versus progress. I know you radicals love throwing out old ideas, but traditions usually exist for a reason. They are the cultural DNA that survive the test of time. Whether it's family structures, community rituals, or moral codes, these evolved because they worked and kept society cohesive. When I talk about social order, I also mean preserving traditions that give people identity and continuity. You start dismantling all traditions in the name of progress, and you get alienation, moral ambiguity, and a society that doesn't know itself. Look at how rapidly things are changing now. People are more anxious and divided than ever, partly because we've thrown away shared values and norms.
I don't think all tradition is automatically bad. I enjoy holiday meals as much as the next person. Grins, but let's be real. A lot of traditions have been outright harmful, or at least stifling. Traditional family structures, for example, often meant patriarchy. Women had fewer rights, kids had no say, etc. Traditional community rituals might have included shunning outsiders or maintaining racial segregation. Those were traditions in many places. Should we keep those cultural DNA because they lasted a long time? I'd say no. Progress is about questioning and improving upon the past, not discarding everything, but keeping what is good and ditching what is unjust. Yes, it can be unsettling to change, but it can also liberate people. The anxiety people feel today, I'd argue a lot of it comes from present injustices and rapid economic changes under capitalism, rather than just lost tradition. Plus, new traditions can form. Humans will always create culture. We can build traditions that are inclusive and voluntary rather than oppressive.
Inclusive and voluntary. You make it sound like all tradition is oppressive until proven otherwise. I see tradition as a source of wisdom. Maybe not every single tradition is good, I'll grant you that. But the wholesale tearing down of norms worries me. If you overthrow everything, you don't know what unintended consequences will come. Sometimes institutions and norms exist because they prevent worse outcomes. For example, a strong sense of community and family. You might call it old-fashioned, but it helped people support each other. Now in modern liberated society, people often feel rootless, isolated, and we have other problems like broken families or community breakdown. So progress isn't an automatic win if it creates new problems. There's something to be said for respecting the accumulated experience of generations.
I'm not advocating chaos or throwing everyone into some void of normlessness. I'm saying let's evaluate things critically. If a tradition fosters genuine community and doesn't harm, sure, it can stay. But if it's just around because that's how it's always been, and it limits people's rights or happiness, then why not change it? I think humans are resilient enough to find meaning even as society evolves. We can create new shared values. Look at how ideas about human rights or equality, which were radical a couple of centuries ago, are now widely valued. That's a new tradition of sorts, born from progress. And frankly, I find the idea of clinging to the past for its own sake kind of defeatist. Like we're saying we can't do any better than our great-great-grandparents did. I believe we can.
Alright, you believe in humanity's ability to perfect itself. I'm more cautious. Let's hit the last big one, individual versus collective rights. You often talk about the community, the collective, the group. That makes me worry about individual freedom. In a collectivist system, what if I, as an individual, don't want to go along with the group's decision? Do I get forced for the good of the community? One thing I value in our current system, flawed as it is that it theoretically respects individual rights, free speech, property rights, freedom of association, etc. I fear that in your ideal world, the individual is expected to conform to whatever the collective decides, or else. That's how it went in many communist regimes. Step out of line, and you're an enemy of the people.
I get the concern, but I think you're picturing the wrong kind of collective. I'm against authoritarian communism precisely because it crushed individual freedom. Anarcho-communism is actually about maximizing freedom for everyone, not just a privileged few. The idea is that by working together as equals, we each have more real freedom than under a system of bosses, kings, or bureaucrats. It's not about forcing conformity, it's about cooperation. If you truly don't want to go along with a group decision, you'd have avenues to voice that, even to opt out and do your own thing as long as it's not harming others. In a small community, consensus isn't always easy, but it tends to produce decisions people can live with, or they adapt and form a different arrangement. Also, individual rights like free expression would be valued. Why wouldn't they be? The difference is we don't elevate property rights above all else. We think the right to not be exploited or not starve is more important than the right of a billionaire to own 5 mansions, you know?
The billionaire with 5 mansions is always the punching bag. Chuckles, but I get your point. You prioritize economic equality over protecting the individual accumulation of wealth. I, on the other hand, worry that when you start saying for the greater good, you can justify trampling on someone's freedom in the name of that good. It's a slippery slope. Today, oh, just give up this little thing for the community. Tomorrow you have no say at all. In my view, a society that respects individuals, their differences, their ambitions, tends to be more dynamic and innovative. Collectivist systems sometimes pressure everyone to be the same or punish those who stand out. I'd rather deal with a bit of inequality than live under a uniform, imposed equality.
We're probably not going to agree on this, but I'll respond to that slippery slope worry. In an anarchist system, there's no central authority to impose uniformity. The whole point is decentralization and voluntary association. Could social pressure be an issue? Sure, humans are humans. But compare that to what we have now. Corporate and state power basically dictate a lot of how we live, and if you disobey, you face jail or poverty. I'd say that's a pretty hefty imposition on individual life already, just one we've normalized. In a communal system, if one community felt stifling, You could in principle leave and join or start another that fits your vibe better. Since land and resources aren't locked up by private owners, the flexibility could actually increase individual choice in the grand scheme. And as for innovation, I think people can be wildly creative when knowledge is shared and anyone can contribute, rather than innovation being driven by who can get venture capital or corporate funding. Different motivators, but humans don't stop being creative just because they're working cooperatively.
Fair enough. You have an answer for everything, even if I'm not fully convinced. To me, your vision sounds like a risky social experiment that bets heavily on people's better nature. I'm skeptical, maybe call it cynicism, but I believe in preparing for the worst in human behavior, not the best. Hierarchy, strong governance, respect for tradition, and individual accountability, those to me are ways to channel human nature into something productive and stable. Tear all that down for an egalitarian commune world, and I worry it'd collapse or turn into something ugly.
And to me, your vision sounds like doubling down on a system that already produces a lot of ugliness, inequality, oppression, you name it, just because we're used to it. Sure, I'm an optimist about people, but not blind. I just think when people aren't placed in oppressive structures from birth, they can surprise you in good ways. We've never really tried a full free cooperative society, not on a large scale, so maybe it's the real unexplored path, not just a naive experiment.
It's true. Neither of us can point to a perfect real-world example. History has mostly been somewhere in between our extremes. Maybe a bit of hierarchy, a bit of cooperation. Maybe that's what actually works, a mix. But I admit, these are big questions. At least we can have a beer and argue about it without coming to blows, right?
On that, my friend, we absolutely agree. Cheers to friendly disagreements on how to save the world.